Welcome to Innovations in Education. I'm your host, David Adams, CEO of the Urban Assembly. And on this show, we bring guests every single episode who have made things work in public education. This show is about the innovators. This show is about the folks who are solving problems. This show is about making things work in education. Now, there's a lot of shows out there talking about what's wrong in the education systems, and those are great shows. There's some shows talking about what we're not doing well, and there's a lot to learn from those, but that's not this show. This show is going to be featuring educators who are making things work for young people and improving public education. Welcome back to Innovations in Public Education. I'm your host, David Adams, and today I am joined by Dr. Deborah Kenny. Deborah is an American educator and author of The Well-Educated Child and Born to Rise. Deborah, you are the founder and chief executive of the Harlem Village Academies, a network of charter schools in Harlem, New York, and the founder of the Deeper Learning Institute, a graduate school and learning lab embedded in the HVA campus. As one of the most prominent educators in our country, Deborah, you have advocated for the importance of deeper learning in pre-K to 12 education, including performance assessment, student agency, restorative discipline, and intrinsic motivation. You hold a PhD and MA from Teachers College, Columbia University, and a BA from the University of Pennsylvania. Deborah, welcome to the show.
So nice to be with you.
Well, Deborah, we went through your bio, and that's one way to get a sense of who you are. But let's get a little bit of sense of how you've come to be into this space. First, can you tell me a little bit about yourself and what problem your Harlem Village Academies exist to solve for?
Sure. I am a mother of 3 and a lifelong educator. And I guess the problem originally was best articulated by Jeff Canada when I met him back in 1999. And, he said, hey, these kids have all the potential in the world, but they're not being properly served and they're not being properly educated, and it's unconscionable. And, we need to do something about it. And that's why we started the schools, essentially to make an excellent education available to all children.
I appreciate that, this idea of what we need to do for our children. And I know you talked about being a mother, but let's look at a little bit about you. Where you from? What brought you to education? Were you bit by a radioactive education spider, and that's how you became super spider educator, Harlem Village Academy? Is that how that worked?
I was born in Newark.
You were born in Newark.
Go Newark. Grew up in New Jersey, had a very typical American's high school education. And I kind of mean, pretty boring. A lot of kids are bored in high school.
Mm.
But in terms of what made me interested in education, it's hard to know exactly where to start because my father was a school teacher in the early years before he switched to being a stockbroker. And my mother tells me that I asked for a chalkboard to be placed in my bedroom when I was a little girl, like in first grade. And then I set up chairs and all the dolls to be students so I could be the teacher. So
It wasn't your first career, though, right? I think even given your childhood ambition, you didn't come straight into education.
I actually was a camp counselor for many years, and it was a camp that was very education oriented. So we actually wrote lesson plans and we did teaching. I did find intellectual history and religion and literature and philosophy to be the most compelling things I wanted to study as an undergrad. But then for graduate school, I was very drawn to education, and I was teaching for a while I was getting my doctorate. But somebody at some point along the way, I said, maybe I could be a teacher and then a principal. So I contemplated that idea when I was in grad school. And I remember a professor saying, oh, you could never be a school principal. It's too bureaucratic. You are too impatient. You wouldn't last a minute. And this is before charter schools existed. And so I was kind of discouraged from that. I actually remember the one and only time that I ever went to a career counselor. It was this one appointment, but this woman seemed really interesting. And she brought me through an exercise called the 7 stories exercise. And she said, the first thing I want you to do is I want you to just write down on a piece of paper, anytime you were happy, what were you doing? And it can be anything, just throughout your whole life. It could be your running, it could be your reading, it could be just anything. So it was like a brainstorm. And then she said, okay, pick the 7 things out of all of those when you were the absolute happiest. And a lot of them involved my children, and they involved teaching, and they involved like running activities. And I wrote about them. And long story short, her analysis was, you have an educator's heart, but like an entrepreneur's mind. So
Wow.
why don't you, and this, I think it might have been 97 or something. No, it was earlier than that. So she said, why don't you look into the field of, children's products or services? And so I remember meeting with all sorts of CEOs. I met with like the CEO of Stride Rite and of Hasbro and, a bunch of companies. And then I remember thinking, they're not trying to help children. They're kind of just somewhere between selling to or exploiting children. That's not interesting to me. But I thought she was right. I had that spirit of, so I came upon, by good fortune, the parenting group. At the time, it was Time Warner. And they had Parenting Magazine, but they were building like a little mini empire of products for new mothers. And I didn't last long, and I'll tell you why.
Tell me why.
I did not do well there because I kept wanting to do things that would help. Like, for example, I said, do you realize how many new mothers are born into poverty and they don't have the background, the resources? What if we did like a series of books that they would receive every, I would come up with these ideas and they would say, well, there's no profit margin in that if they don't have the money. And I said, well, maybe we could get someone to sponsor it. And they kind of looked at me like I was a weirdo. And I remember these little insults that the marketing director would throw my way. Like, she came into my office one day and sort of made this snide comment, looks like a library in here, because I had some books. I did not fit well in a corporate setting at all. So that didn't work out. But then I went to Sesame Street and I thought, well, here's my big chance to do some good. And, along the way came up with some ideas like, how about, booklets for new mothers, but ultimately it was still about marketing and I was not comfortable in that environment. It wasn't interesting. It wasn't meaningful. And so that's around the time I met Jeff Canada. What happened was I was at Sesame Street and I was feeling unfulfilled. And I just decided I'm going to try to meet some people and see if I can come up with an idea for what I could do, because I don't want to, and I had been promoted from, I forget the first role, but I was promoted to president of Sesame Street Publishing. So successful but unhappy, I guess.
Successful but
And
unhappy.
so I met Jonah Edelman. I can't remember how we met, but then Jonah was just starting Stand for Children.
He's out in the Midwest, right?
Yes, he's in Portland now, but he was in DC. And so I visited him in DC
Yeah.
and he was teaching communities how to organize. He
Right.
was doing community organizing training. I just found that fascinating. Like, it lit me up. It was such meaningful, interesting work. And I was still trying to figure out my place. And then Jeff Canada was on his board. So I met Jeff Canada and I was completely mesmerized by him. And, the very
You
next
must have been
day,
the only person mesmerized by Jeff Canada. Singular person in the world is like, that guy, maybe he's going to be all right.
oh my gosh. Well, he had this baby college, this training program. So I went to the next day to observe it. And so I just started exploring. That's sort of the end of that chapter.
So lead me to the space. Now you're talking to Jonah, you're talking to Jeff. There's a shift that says I can do something. And we talked a little about this, like, what was the problem? And the problem wasn't just uninspired education, because I think you have a deeper sense of what Harlem Village Academies represents in the space of public education. So what's the spark that says, if not me, then who? I'm going to solve this. The future is in my hands, insofar as providing a solution.
Definitely did not think about me or that that I was going to do it, but rather I thought, teachers are undervalued in society. And if I could bring together a group of really brilliant teachers, then together we could figure out how to design a school that is more aspirational. One of the first teachers, her name was Rebecca. I remember so clearly when I asked her in the interview process, after I had spent a long time describing the vision,
Hmm.
I said, okay, why do you want to join our school as opposed to any of the other places you could work? It was just, a random question during the interview process. She said, because you want to do the schools nobody thinks can be done.
Mm.
And I think that's what drew us all to each other as educators. It was this idea that children are capable of so much more. Like Zaretta Hammond says, they're capable of cognitive rigor if we just give them the chance to be challenged. And so, we wanted schools that we would send our own children to. We wanted schools that yes, we were idealistic, but practical idealists. We
Mhm.
believe that this is possible.
Mm. So we sit in a space where you are starting to envision a solution to this problem. And this problem of uninspired education, this problem of a narrow education, this problem of young people being dismissed for what they could accomplish. And you bring together this group of educators. And now, is this like the Captain Planet educators, fire, wind, rain? Who are these folks? Because in your book, you spend a lot of time thinking about these first group of people who come together under this vision of what education can be. Tell me a little bit about these folks who were inspired and inspire you as you built your school.
Well, in the very first year, we had the most brilliant math teacher named Nick. I would have put my kids in his class any day of the week. Nick Timpone, his name was just truly brilliant educator. Instead of what was happening in all the other schools that I saw, where well-meaning but misguided and, perhaps just not well taught teachers, new enthusiastic, they would use games and chants and songs and tricks and mnemonic memory devices, to quote unquote make math fun.
Mm,
But it wasn't the math that was fun. It was, the little song they would make up. And it was all about memorization,
mhm,
making up a song to memorize a formula. Whereas Nick would have kids be enthralled by the math itself, which is just, exquisite, and would teach the underlying concept first, not teach a little song so you could memorize a formula, which is not teaching math. That's
mm,
just teaching you to memorize a song. And so we bonded over this book, The Teaching Gap by Stigler and Hebert, which compares how math is taught in Germany, Japan, and the US. And it's, in short, we were the only charters at the time, that we knew of in our area doing, certainly in New York, doing constructivist math instruction, like in Singapore and Japan, where instead of, the I do, we do, you do, which is this lesson starts with everybody watch me. Well, you're
mhm,
immediately making the child's mind passive, right?
mm,
And the teacher just models something. Now we're going to do it together. Now you do it on your own, practice and memorize. That's the formula. That was the American way. That was what was happening in the schools we visited, the urban
mm,
schools we visited. Instead, what this teaching gap taught about how math is taught in Japan and Singapore, and Nick was like a masterful teacher in this approach, was we're going to spend the first 20 minutes trying to solve a problem. Now, that problem was very thoughtfully selected, very thoughtfully designed. It was based on something they had been studying. And it was, Vygotsky's concept that the zone of proximal development, which basically means you want the kid to be challenged. It's the porridge, not too hot, not too cold, just right.
yeah.
The work can't be too challenging that it's out of reach. It can't be too easy, but it has to be some challenge that they can do, And so 20 minutes trying to solve a problem. And during that process, I mean, we could spend the whole hour just on this. It's so fascinating. But suffice it to say that the kids would, at the end of that lesson, internalize the concept.
Mhm.
So they didn't need to memorize the formulas. So that was Nick. Then there was another example, Rebecca, also just so committed, so brilliant. I mean, just between the two of them alone, as two of our first teachers, the level of caring and commitment and hard work, it was just mind blowing. So, you know, back to this idea that Rebecca
Mhm.
said, you want to do the schools that nobody thinks they can be done. It was schools that would teach. We didn't call it this at the time because we didn't know enough, or I didn't know enough, but use a deeper learning approach
Mm.
while also making sure that the kids are, getting all the foundational knowledge and skills they need. And in the case of our first school, we started with fifth grade.
Right.
They had 10 years of a bad education. They'd come to us 3 or 4 years behind. It took 10 years of doing the middle and then the high school till we finally then started in elementary.
Likely. Yeah.
And then after that, we started Montessori pre-K. So now we finally have the full range pre-K to 12.
And there's some key things that are coming out in your recollection of the starting of the school. One is this notion of constructivism, how students can develop a sense of a problem and a sense of the concept by working through it and being in discourse with each other. There's this conversation about how to challenge students. And I want to bring out some ideas for you to respond to. So Ted Sizer says that the purpose of school is to teach students how to use their minds well. James Baldwin says that the purpose of school is to create in a person the ability to look at themselves or at the world for themselves and make their own decisions. All right. So the ability for a person to look at the world for themselves and make their own decisions. What do you see as the purpose of education? And how did that vision serve you as the creator of the Harlem Village Academies?
Okay, two of my favorite quotes, two of my favorite people.
I took it from your
And
book, I mean, it's not
uh,
random.
well, so teaching students to use their minds well includes being an independent thinker.
Mhm.
And being an independent thinker is not possible unless you also know how to use your mind well. So to me, they're mutually reinforcing and they're complementary. What I love about Baldwin's famous talk to teachers and, his notion of independence, it really ties into the idea of agency, which we talk about so much in the book, and how that is central to being well educated. So Baldwin is basically saying your responsibility is to have such a strong foundation of knowledge and quality thinking that you can then challenge the
Mm.
society in which you're living. He also, interestingly, talks about how, well, that's not really what societies want. They want conformity.
I don't know if you've noticed the
Right.
political conversation these days, but yes, it's a little testing out there.
Right. And so, I think being an independent thinker is something that we've gone over that. Everybody is all for it. People talk about it. I think there's no shortage of independent thinking, but I think there is a shortage of knowledge and humility among young people today. And
Mhm.
so they'll jump to having an opinion without really having a foundation upon which that opinion is. It's definitely not the Baldwin level. I mean, he grew up 3 blocks from where we're sitting right now and
Mhm.
talks about how he read every book in the Harlem Library,
Mhm.
and he read everything, the
Yeah.
classics, diverse
Yeah.
books, everything. And it was on a foundation of being such a well-read and knowledgeable person
Yeah.
that he then could be as powerful as he was. And that's what I want for our young people today.
I want to sit with this idea of humility and agency because they almost feel like they're opposites of each other, right? And you talk about intellectual humility. I wrote a blog post maybe 3 months ago about what virtues do we need in the age of AI, intellectual virtues. And one of the ones that I put out was this notion of intellectual humility. What do I know and what do I not? In order to inform my ability to take in information effectively. And so James Baldwin reads the entire library, but still maintains the sense of intellectual humility and champions a sense of agency. Can you help me disentangle some of these ideas in ways that we can balance them for the folks who are listening?
Yeah, sure. I mean, Professor Eddie Glaude is the expert on Baldwin, not me. Having said that, I think humility is when you know how much you don't know. I think the really, really smartest people have the highest level of humility. So those two go together very well, in my view. And that's one of the big things that we need to work on, those of us interested in deeper learning, which is students need to understand through experiences like writing a research paper, for example, how little you actually know about most things, just about everything.
Hmm.
And the way that they can come to understand that one way is by studying one thing really deeply
Yeah.
through, let's say, a research project that they would do over the course of a year. And let's say they're reading 30 or 40 different articles or book chapters and talking to experts and looking at competing views, looking at,
Really?
opposing viewpoints on something, reading the source behind the source behind the source. And by the time they're done with that,
Hmm.
and they understand this one little segment of a subject, but they
Mm.
really, I mean, they've studied it for a year. Now they know what it means to really understand something. And that will confer a perspective of both humility and really good judgment because they'll understand, oh, well, if this is what it is to really know something, then if I read this article, even if it's in the New York Times, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It's 50-50 that it's right. And there's probably a lot that they were rushing to. Let me read a few more things before I
Mm.
even think about, having an opinion on this.
I think what's interesting here is that in the age of AI, the ability to access information and the ability to feel informed is easier than the ability to have deep knowledge and understanding the character of the problem. I think it's Patton who said, planning is everything, the plan is nothing. Planning gives you a sense of the character of the problem. And then I hear you saying that knowledge and deep knowledge gives you a sense of the character of the problem set or the debate. And I want to spend a little bit more time on this because I think it can be seductive in 2026 to have OpenAI or even Claude tell us about a thing and then for us to say, I know this thing. It's almost like why the scene in The Matrix where Keanu Reeves gets a little like upload and says, I know Kung Fu, right? Why that's not realistic, not because it's, machines fighting humans and all that kind of stuff, but because it kind of doesn't honor what the learning process actually is, right? Like Kung Fu is not something one could learn from a computer program. It's something one has to embody. And I'm hearing the same argument for you in terms of knowledge.
Yeah, I am definitely not the technology expert. Having said that, I have championed low tech and no tech in our schools. I want us, our kids, you'll go into our classrooms, you'll see notebooks.
Mhm.
I think it has to be notebooks, not Chromebooks. They have to write. Writing is how you think and process
Mhm.
information. And there's something about writing in a pen and paper that I think is valuable and critical. But there's so many different angles to this. Which one are you most interested in?
I think I'm interested to hear, and I think I know what you're going to say, but I think it's helpful to elevate it. The seductiveness of instant information and the difference between knowing something deeply by really studying a thing and knowing something because you prompted an LLM to ask it to summarize a corpus of knowledge that you then take in and repeat. I heard you talk about students looking at the source of the source of the source.
Right.
In 2026, you can just write a prompt and feel like you know a thing. So I want us to think a little bit about this idea of the seduction of thinking I know something versus knowing something deeply because I have engaged in the productive struggle of looking at many different aspects of it and understanding it from a number of different angles. And
Right. Well, I think that there is never, ever, ever going to be a time ever where reading the greatest works of literature, oratory, political philosophy, the greatest speeches, nonfiction poetry, and that foundation of the great ideas, the great works is not the way to become well educated,
Mm.
from which you then have a vantage point to evaluate information you encounter.
From which you have an vantage
As
point.
a vantage point.
Yes.
Yeah, a
Okay.
vantage
Say
point.
more.
Unless you are immersed
Mm.
from K to 12 in, what the best minds of human history have produced, then we're doing a disservice to children and that includes classics and diverse. It includes all the greatest work of civilization is the birthright of all children. That's what should be and must be the foundation of their education. Once you have the breadth and depth of knowledge and insight, then you can use, leverage, or evaluate information you encounter, whether it's through AI or otherwise. It's
Mhm.
the only way. There is no way around that. Nor
Okay.
should there be, and nor should there be. It's, I think, a mistake to get too excited about this technology, and certainly a mistake to experiment on children. I'll tell you, there's something I've been wondering, which is if there was no profit attached to AI, just
Mhm.
wave a magic wand and pretend that there was no way it could make a profit, would we be rushing to put it in our schools?
Mm.
I don't think so. We'd be the opposite. We'd say, well, let's do a pilot, let's test it for 5 or 10 years. Not just gonna like put something in the schools. This our most precious children, our
Mm.
children, and we're gonna experiment on them before we know what it will do, the effect it will have.
Mm.
But back to your original question, the one and only time in your life that you have a chance to become well read,
Mm.
to become knowledgeable, to gain insights, it's during these K to 12 years. We have
Mhm.
to be very careful how we go about that.
Mm. Mhm.
I'm very thoughtful about it.
Well, I have two directions I want to go in here. I don't know if I want to stay on the AI or want to think about the nature of reasoning and thinking. I think I'm going to stay on the AI. So recently, Claude or Anthropic released a constitution for their AI bot, Claude. It's got 80 points of reasoning. And their emphasis is on developing the ethical character of this AI, the ethical reasoning of this AI, and they're putting the best minds of philosophy to this task because they believe that AI is so important and so powerful that the most important thinkers in ethics and social and emotional character development need to be investing in AI. I want to get your sense of what does it mean to invest in AI in terms of character, social, emotional development, ethical decision making, reasoning, while we are arguing about these same subjects for our young people in public education. Just want to get your take on that dichotomy.
So interesting. Well, first of all, I am absolutely not the expert in this. I'm the opposite. Having said that, you said the most important thinkers don't agree with each other.
Mm.
So, what does that even mean? Because there's not just one. I mean, it seems obvious, but there's not just one approach to ethics. There's
Mm.
not just one definition. The great minds argue.
Sure. Yeah.
There's this great documentary called Arguing the World. It was about some of the New York intellectuals at City College. So I don't even know what that means. There is no one approach to ethics. So it is way above my pay grade. I will say that.
Well, I mean, I don't know if I would agree. I think you've put ethics at the center of.
No, I meant
Um,
AI.
I want to juxtapose this, right? You care about ethics for your young
Yes.
people. You care about the kinds of people that graduate from your school. You care about our society in the context of public education. And so I think you share this expertise. And I know your skepticism on AI and young people. I'm interested in your thoughts on like what does it mean to invest in machines while being skeptical in the larger conversation of how public education, character development, ethical development, social emotional development should interact for real life kids. And I just want to get your sense on that because you don't feel that that's something that we should not be doing for kids, but some people do.
Well, I'm a huge Jonathan Haidt fan.
Mm,
I did not even allow my children to watch TV
mm,
until 5th grade.
mhm,
So that was the technology of the time. I remember when email started
mm,
and they were beginning to have computers, I took all of the furniture out of our dining room, put it in the garage, took the kids' desks, put them in the dining room so that every night I would be able to, we'd all be together. And the dining room and den, living family room, they were like attached. So you could be doing your homework or you could be reading or just hanging out, but you can't be by yourself on this computer. So that gives you a little insight into how, and in our schools, in addition to notebooks, we really discourage PowerPoints.
mm,
You'll see chart paper on the walls,
mhm.
like as if it's the 1970s. So it's hard for me I think that reading and writing, as an example, are two of the most important things you could do, and student discourse, like a Socratic seminar,
Mhm.
that's what kids should be spending most of their time doing.
Mhm.
Now, I do understand that, you know, all the power and potential of technology and that you have to be proficient in certain things for certain reasons. But, look at what happened with social media. They said how great and wonderful it was going to be. And it's created one of the biggest problems that society's had to face. So I'm skeptical right now.
I receive that, and yet you're not skeptical on the role of ethics in public education. You're not skeptical of
Oh, of
how
course.
character should relate to schooling.
Oh, absolutely. So in the graduate profile that we designed, where we articulated the outcomes we wanted for our students by the time
Mhm,
they graduate from our pre-K to 12 schools, there are these three categories which define, in a way, it's our vision for deeper learning.
mhm,
It's also in the book, The Well-Educated Child has these three sections: quality thinking, student agency, and ethical purpose. So
mhm.
to your point, in my view, it's so important that it's one of the three most fundamental things that you want to build in a school and that you want to see in terms of outcomes for the kids.
Why is that controversial in 2026? I think it is. I mean, I think that there have been laws put forth in state governments that have said that character development is the purview of parents and school should not speak to elements of identity or character. And some laws passed in some states along those
Oh,
lines. As skeptical as you are as AI, people are skeptical of public education with regards to these larger purposes.
oh, well, that makes sense. That makes perfect sense to me because it goes back to what we were saying before, because people have different definitions of character and ethics.
Mhm,
People want different things. And so it's very personal.
mhm,
And, some people want their child to learn one thing that is the opposite of what other people want their child to learn. And since it's a public school, I think that there are parents who are disconcerted with the direction of school, that, it's focusing too much on one thing to the detriment of something else that they might find more valuable. And
mhm,
so I think that's valid.
mhm,
Um, I doubt that there is any parent who would object to students learning about integrity,
mhm,
kindness, responsibility on any side of the political spectrum.
mhm,
Some of these universal values,
mhm,
virtues, values. I think virtues is more identified as something that is permanent and universal, whereas values is more, we can each choose our own. I think here from our graduate profile, I'll just look at some of these: integrity, respect, loving kindness, these things all parents want. So I guess it's controversial to the extent that our society has become polarized. And
Yeah.
that, I think, is a serious issue that we need to address. Now, as a mother, I recognized very early on that my kids who were in public schools were not going to learn values at all in school. I mean, they
Mm.
went to their classes, each a different subject, and that was it. Taught that in many ways,
Right. Right.
I sent them to Sunday school and Hebrew school. We made sandwiches for the homeless once a month. When I gave them allowance, I would get like 10 different, you see how old I am, 10 different envelopes to get to and put them on the floor and say, okay, instead of giving them a $10 bill once a month, I'd give them 10 $1 bills or
Mm.
whatever it was. And then I'd say, okay, how much of this are you going to give to charity before you take for yourself? Well, which charity do you want to give to? And have a discussion about that.
Mhm.
There were so many different ways that, parents teach ethics. And I think if schools could stick to universal, then it wouldn't be controversial.
Mhm.
And there's, God knows it would be helpful for parents. And I know teachers, care about this, to have students really internalize and care about being a kind person.
Mhm.
It almost seems, I don't know, quaint to say it, but kids, there are certain things they absolutely need
Mhm.
to be happy, to be grounded. They're assaulted by commercialism and materialism. That's, values in American society. So there's a lot of good work that can be done without touching on some of the controversial questions.
I
By
receive that. I think as I reflect on your book, the reason why I want to spend some time on this is because you are such a value-driven person, coming from your experiences in religion, coming from experience in camp, coming from the Quaker kind of background and ideas. Like, you are not neutral about your belief, from my perspective, of the role of education in shaping who people are. And the point that you made about your kids was that they're going through public schools in a value neutral context, which you were skeptical of. You're like, I don't think people should move through a whole public institution and not have the ability to at least interrogate. Because I thought you used a word before, which is like stand on the balcony and have insight to through a corpus of knowledge that gives us perspective in order to generate our own perspective of what we want to be and who we want to aspire to be in the world.
Yeah, when I thought about their public school, which was, it was good. It wasn't as amazing now in retrospect. I wish I had known then what I know now, which is the whole
Mm,
reason I wrote the book,
mm,
so that other people won't have to go through all the struggle I did to learn, about the most essential and profound, exquisite, aspects of education that we should be providing to our kids. But I, I thought if I do nothing, they'll be sucked into the values, American values.
because nothing is
Um,
neutral. I think that's the point I
right,
wanted to elevate,
exactly,
right? Nothing is
exactly.
really neutral.
Right, right. Nothing is neutral. You're either moving forward or moving backward. You're either
Mm,
working toward the light or being sucked into the darkness. I
mhm, mhm.
definitely believe that.
Well, okay. So we got a sense now that you developed a philosophy of a school that's grounded in ethics, but also grounded in deeper learning. So I want to take maybe 3 or 4 minutes to talk about thinking. I want to talk about intrinsic motivation. I want to talk about challenge and authentic work. I want to think about application of knowledge and metacognition. I want to get your sense of why these ideas are important in education and why these ideas are important in thinking.
Oh, those are really important. And I appreciate you bringing that to the table. So I guess we could start with application of knowledge, which is also
Mhm,
known in the field as transfer. Grant
mhm,
Wiggins said, the late great Grant Wiggins, that in his mind, transfer is perhaps the whole point of education itself.
generalization, right?
Your ability to use what you know. And so in the book, the classical example that's given for application of knowledge that I took an excerpt from a study was if you teach students the difference between arteries and veins. And so if it's just some basics like what are the properties? How are they different? How are they alike? And, you're kind of given this information, you memorize it, and then you say it back. Okay, you've memorized some facts. But if you're asked to study it on your own so that you can then design an artificial artery, now you're doing something of value with the knowledge.
Mhm.
That's what the application of knowledge is.
Mm.
And whoever was, I don't know who it was, the first person who, you know, did this saved lives, right?
Right.
So that's in brief why application of knowledge is so important.
Mhm.
You asked about intrinsic motivation. This is something that we cared about.
This is something you're a pet peeve of yours, right?
Well,
So let's get it out there. You
wait,
don't
what do you
like,
mean?
from my read, you have a deep belief in the ability of young people to motivate themselves given learning tasks that are worthy of their time. So just hit me up. Like,
Okay. Well,
we don't like the
I'm
claps, the call
skeptical of
responses.
I know what you were getting at. I'm skeptical of external motivations like
That's right.
prizes and
That's right.
rewards and things like that.
Right.
And, without really having the vocabulary back, you know, 25 years ago when we first started, I didn't know to call it this, but I knew this is what we wanted. You
Mhm.
know, I want kids to behave well, not because there's going to be a reward or a punishment, but because they actually care about being a good person, which is something, isn't that something we all want for our
It,
kids, right?
it is.
So we want them to spend hours and hours and hours working really hard on their science experiment and writing up the lab report because they are so enthralled with the question that the problem they're solving, the experiment they're doing. They care so much about the quality of their work. They want to work on it more and more to make it as great as it can be. Not, well, what's the grade I'll get? And,
Mhm.
and what's going to be on the test. I mean,
Class rank. You talked
what
about that a little bit.
exactly. I mean,
Yeah.
what kind of person are we producing? And
The question. You see, I think that's like the thing that always drives me when I read your work, when I speak to you, is that you're constantly grounded in this question, academically, cognitively, ethically, character-wise. What kind of person are our schools producing? And I just wanted to repeat that back because everything we do speaks to our youth about what kind of person we want them to be, how we organize class rank, how we lift up student voice, our discipline systems, right? And I just feel like you are so, I know it may sound like to our folks that I'm saying Deborah is very skeptical of this and skeptical of that, but it to show that you are skeptical of a thing because you believe in another thing. And the thing you believe in is very, very clear. You know what I mean?
yeah. So the thing I'm skeptical of with regard to the grades and points and credit and extra credit and class rank, I do not want our children, my own children, our children in our schools, our nation's children to be going through their entire K to 12 education like it's a rat race so that they can get a score or, beat out somebody else just so that, they'll have something good to put in their college application. And all the while, talk about not being present, all the while missing out on, what Einstein talked about, you know, understanding the mysteries of the universe. I mean, you only get one chance at your education and then, you're working most of the rest of your life. So
Hmm.
are you going to be just rushing through it, and you're doing it for something else or for someone else? Or are you going to really be not only present, but leverage all the opportunities that are in front of you? So our culture, is a culture of putting kids on a treadmill and having them think that, the point of reading is so that you'll get a good score on the test rather than so that you'll encounter the world's greatest ideas. This is very important and really glad that we're ending on that too, because I think that's this whole idea of helping children to realize there's a such thing as purpose in one's life and
Mhm.
discerning your calling and figuring out, well, why was I put on this earth and what am I
Mhm.
here to contribute? What is my life about? What is my thing? And there should be time and space for that.
Mhm.
In addition to a very rigorous and challenging education in all other ways, there should be time and space during advisory, periodically to think and talk about that in school, because it's not that they're going to find their calling. I mean, that doesn't often happen by 12th grade. It usually happens more in adulthood, but they'll know that purpose is a thing
Mhm.
and that it is something for them to be thinking about, and that life isn't about being performative for others. It's your inner life.
Well, Deb, we started off with this conversation about how you came to start HVA. What was your vision? What was your staff? How did you honor your teachers in the generation of your school? We went over to talk a little bit about what it means to learn effectively. What kinds of learners do we want to produce? What kind of people we want to produce? And then we've landed in this conversation about agency, this question about purpose. And if I may say so myself, I think the world is better off for you having lived your purpose vis-a-vis your contributions to public education, your contributions to our children, and certainly your contributions to New York City itself. And so very excited to have you on the show. When people want to find your book, what's the best place for them to be able to grab that book?
Well, the welleducatedchild.org has all the different, and I just want to say back at you, David.
Thank you.
You are inspiring to all of us.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, Deb, we'll talk again soon. And folks, the area that you can get to is to go to her book. There's one more time,
Oh, the welleducatedchild.org.
thewelleducatedchild.org. Thank you, Deborah.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to our latest episode of Innovations in Education, where we bring education leaders who have made things work in the education sector. If you like this episode, please subscribe so that you can hear more great content around innovations in education. I've been your host, David Adams, and have a great day.